The old lady, Mrs. Jones, lived in a small house on the edge of the woods. She had two dogs, a golden retriever named Buddy and a black lab named Shadow. The dogs were her best friends, and they loved to go for walks in the woods with her. One day, it was a very cold winter day. The snow was falling heavily, and the wind was blowing fiercely. Mrs. Jones decided to go for a walk in the woods anyway, even though it was dangerous. She knew that the dogs would enjoy it, and she wanted to get some fresh air. Mrs. Jones bundled up in her coat, hat, scarf, and mittens, and she led the dogs out into the woods. The snow was so deep that it came up to their knees. The dogs wagged their tails and ran ahead, enjoying the winter wonderland. Mrs. Jones walked for a while, enjoying the peace and quiet of the woods. She was lost in thought when she suddenly realized that she was lost. She couldn't see the path anymore, and the dogs were nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Jones started to panic. She didn't know what to do. She was all alone in the woods, and it was getting dark. She started to cry. "Buddy, Shadow," she called out, "where are you?" There was no answer. Mrs. Jones wandered around for a while, trying to find her way back to the path. But the snow was falling so heavily that she couldn't see anything. She was starting to lose hope. Just when she was about to give up, she heard a bark. She looked up and saw Buddy running towards her. Shadow was right behind him. The dogs were so happy to see her. They jumped up on her and licked her face. Mrs. Jones hugged them tightly. "Thank you," she said. "You saved me." The dogs wagged their tails. They knew that they had done a good thing. Mrs. Jones led the dogs back to the path, and they soon found their way home. Mrs. Jones was so grateful to the dogs for saving her. She knew that she would never have survived in the woods without them. The next day, Mrs. Jones went to the pet store and bought the dogs each a big bone as a reward. The dogs were so happy to have their own bones, and they ate them up quickly. Mrs. Jones, Buddy, and Shadow lived happily ever after. They went for walks in the woods every day, and they always stayed close together. One day, Mrs. Jones was feeling sick. She stayed in bed all day, and the dogs stayed by her side. They licked her face and wagged their tails, trying to make her feel better. Mrs. Jones knew that she was lucky to have such loyal and loving dogs. They were her best friends, and she couldn't imagine her life without them. The dogs lived with Mrs. Jones for many years. They were always there for her, through good times and bad. They were her family, and she loved them very much. When Mrs. Jones passed away, the dogs were heartbroken. They stayed by her side until the very end. After Mrs. Jones was gone, the dogs went to live with a new family. The new family loved the dogs very much, and they took good care of them. The dogs never forgot Mrs. Jones. They would often sit by her grave and think about her. They knew that she would always be in their hearts.